The rain came in cold, needle-sharp spray against my bare neck, and I realized in that moment that I'd made a terrible mistake coming home unprepared for what I would find. My name is Serafina Marie Romano, and until 6 hours ago, I believed I knew the definition of betrayal. I was wrong. I stood on the porch of my 3-bedroom craftsman home, the one I'd bought at 23 years old, the one I'd spent 6 years bleeding for, and watched my brass key refuse to turn in the lock. Not slightly stuck, not jammed. It simply wouldn't penetrate the mechanism at all. My hands, still holding the key, began to shake. The rain intensified, soaking through my cream blouse and turning my dark hair into a curtain that plastered against my face. My suitcase, stuffed with business clothes from a 10-day conference in Portland, sat in a growing puddle at my feet. I'd taken an earlier flight home, eager to get back to my sanctuary. I'd imagined making tea, curling up on my velvet chair by the window, maybe finally starting that book I'd been putting off. I didn't imagine this. A flicker of movement caught my eye through the frosted glass of the door. A face appeared. My younger brother, Julian. I recognized his smug expression immediately, the same expression he'd worn at 14 when he'd convinced our mother to take my college fund to help him start a business. The same expression he'd worn at 22 when he'd crashed my car and I paid for the repairs. He didn't open the door. He raised a remote control, pressed a button, and the new smart lock above the handle beeped. Then he smiled, not a friendly smile, but the kind of smile that comes from someone who's just won something they didn't earn. He mouthed 2 words through the glass, his lips moving with exaggerated clarity. "Go away." Then he turned and disappeared deeper into my house. The rain continued to fall. My heart didn't just break. It felt like something had reached into my chest and ripped it out, leaving only a hollow space where certainty used to live. I realized, standing there in that downpour, that blood isn't thicker than water. Blood is thicker, yes, but it's also much easier to spill. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers, nearly dropping it into the standing water pooling on the porch. My mother's number was still in my favorites. I pressed call. She picked up on the first ring, and her voice came through bright and breezy, like she was having tea on a sunny afternoon instead of raining on her daughter's life. "Sarah, you're back," she chirped. "How was the conference?" I choked on a sob. "Mom, the key won't work. Julian is inside, and he won't let me in. What happened to my door?" The silence that followed was the coldest thing I'd ever experienced. It stretched out like a living thing, filling the space between us with something dark and final. Then came her voice, sharp and devoid of the maternal warmth I'd foolishly expected. "We changed the lock and took the house, Serafina. Julian needs it more than you do. Your things are in the garage. Don't make a scene." The line went dead. I stood there in the rain for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at my phone as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. The key fell from my hand and clattered on the wet concrete. The garage door opened with the keypad code. I hadn't thought to change. Perhaps I should have known better. Perhaps some part of me had always known that the locks I'd installed, the security system I'd paid for, the home I'd poured everything into, none of it truly belonged to me if my mother's signature was on the deed. And it was. That was the whole ugly truth of it. 6 years ago, when I was 23 years old, I'd saved $60,000 through obsessive discipline and 2 simultaneous jobs. Night shifts at a pharmaceutical accounting firm. Days spent as a freelance bookkeeper for small businesses who needed someone meticulous and hungry. I'd eaten ramen noodles for dinner so many nights that I still can't look at them without feeling that familiar knot in my stomach. I'd skipped vacations, skipped celebrations, skipped normal things that people my age took for granted. I'd done all of this for a down payment on a house. But banks don't give mortgages to 23-year-olds without cosigners, no matter how good their credit is. My mother, Diane, had insisted on signing. Just to help you out. Honey, she'd said, with the smile that had always made me feel safe. Your poor father passed away too young. Let me at least do this one thing. I believed her. I'd never questioned why she wanted her name on the deed. Never asked if she had ulterior motives. Never considered that her love might be conditional or that conditions, once set, could change without warning. The garage door groaned shut behind me, and I looked at the devastation within. My life was stacked in damp cardboard boxes next to the trash cans. Water was already seeping into the corners. My hand-tufted Persian rugs, rolled and tied haphazardly with baling twine, leaned against the far wall like headstones in a graveyard. My books, first editions of Austen and the Brownies that my father had left me, were piled in a cardboard box marked in black marker. Sarah's junk. The tag looked aggressive. Intentional. My velvet occasional chair, the one I'd saved 4 months extra for, sat overturned in the corner, its legs scratched where they'd been dragged across my hardwood floors. I sat down on a box labeled kitchen spices and let myself fall apart. The scent of cinnamon and dried basil mixed with the smell of wet concrete and my own tears. I felt small in that moment, invisible, like the girl I'd been at 7 years old when my brother was born and everything changed, like the girl who was always told to give your toys to Julian, Serafina. He's smaller than you. He's special. Like the girl whose accomplishments were met with, "That's nice, honey, but Julian's really struggling right now. Can you help him?" But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a woman with a paper trail, a woman who'd kept every receipt, every mortgage statement, every credit card bill, a woman whose father had loved her enough to leave her something more valuable than money. He'd left me the land itself. I spent that first night in a motel called the Riverside Inn, though it was nowhere near a river. It smelled like lemon bleach and old cigarettes, and the ice machine outside my window made a sound like someone screaming every 40 minutes. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Julian's face through the glass, that smug twist of his mouth as he mouthed, "Go away," to his sister. By 3 a.m., I'd made a decision. I dragged a heavy wooden trunk from my car, the one thing I'd managed to grab from the garage that felt important, and set it on the bed. Inside were my father's old records, documents going back decades, surveys he'd conducted, property histories, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it for years, was a document dated 1987. The Caleb Family Trust. My father, Thomas, had passed away when I was 19. I was 28 now. I'd kept this trunk in my car for 9 years without really understanding what it contained. Dad had been a surveyor, a man who understood land and law with equal precision. Before his death, he'd left me a letter explaining that I should keep these documents safe, should study them when I was ready to understand them. I was ready now. The trust had been established by my grandfather, Caleb Romano, in 1987. The land, 3.2 acres in a desirable neighborhood that had only appreciated in value, was held in perpetuity for the benefit of the family line. My father, as the eldest child, had been the trustee during his life. Upon his death, I became the trustee. My mother, however, was listed as having a life estate on the property. This meant she could live there during her lifetime, that the property would provide for her shelter and security. It was a generous arrangement, one that showed my father's kindness even as he protected his daughter's future. But there were conditions. I found them highlighted in my father's own careful handwriting, dated just weeks before his death. The life estate is forfeited immediately if the occupant, 1, fails to maintain the property's financial integrity through fraud or misrepresentation, 2, enters into a new legal marriage without the express written consent of the primary heir. Or 3, allows a non-heir to claim occupancy or ownership rights through false legal representation. My hands started shaking as I read those words. Diane had been dating a man named Silas Blackwell for approximately 8 months. Silas was a self-proclaimed life coach who'd never held a traditional job and spent most of his time photographing himself for social media. I never trusted him. More importantly, Dad never would have approved of him. And then there was the matter of a romantic weekend. I'd heard about in passing, something about Nevada, about a courthouse, about Diane being coy about her plans. I opened my laptop on the motel bed and started digging through county records in Nevada, specifically checking the courthouse records in Las Vegas, where they like to go for their weekend getaways. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I navigated the public records database. There it was. Marriage license filed. March 14th, 2024 name. Diane Marie Romano name. Silas James Blackwell filed. Clark County Court. 3 weeks ago. She'd married him 3 weeks ago and never said a word. Not a phone call, not a text, not even a casual mention. She'd hidden this from me deliberately because she had always known that it would complicate her legal standing. But she'd miscalculated. She'd assumed that taking the house, locking me out, making me feel powerless would prevent me from discovering the truth. She'd underestimated her daughter's capacity for research and overestimated her own intelligence. I laughed then, a sound that startled me with its coldness. It was the laugh of someone who just realized that her family had handed her exactly what she needed to take back everything they'd stolen. I pulled out my phone and searched for Mr. Brooks. He'd been my father's attorney and friend for 40 years. If anyone would understand the implications of that highlighted trust document, it would be him. He answered on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep. But when I explained who I was, why I was calling at 3:47 a.m., he was fully awake within seconds. "Sarah," he said, and I could hear the shift in his tone from confusion to understanding. "Tell me everything. Every detail. Don't leave anything out." Mr. Brooks and I met at a diner called the Morning Glory at 7 a.m. The smell of burnt coffee and maple syrup filled the air. He was 73 years old, with silver hair and the kind of posture that came from decades of standing in courtrooms. When I spread the trust documents across the laminate table, he didn't just read them. He studied them. His eyes moved slowly across each page, tracking my father's careful handwriting, absorbing the weight of what he was seeing. When he finally looked up, he was wearing a grim smile. "Your mother just committed a massive legal blunder," he said quietly. "By marrying Silas without your consent as primary heir, she violated the explicit conditions of the Caleb Trust. Her life estate is forfeited immediately. She has no legal right to that property anymore." "What about the house?" I asked, my voice steady even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "The mortgage? The deed. The deed is held in trust. The house is part of the trust property, which means," he tapped the document with one weathered finger, "your mother has been occupying a property she no longer has the legal right to live in. Worse, if she's been paying the property taxes from accounts she controls, if she's been claiming occupancy, if she's been making decisions about the property as though she has authority, she's opened herself up to fraud charges." I leaned back in my chair. "And my brother?" "Your brother has no claim whatsoever. If his tenancy was granted by your mother, and it was since the lock change happened under her authority, then his residency is invalid. He's trespassing." "I don't want fraud charges yet," I said slowly, the words forming as I spoke them. "Not immediately. I want her to get comfortable. I want her to think she's won. I want Julian to feel secure in his theft. I want them to believe they've outsmarted me. Mr. Brooks's grim smile widened into something almost approving. The long game. The long game, I confirmed. How much time do we have? Legally, we could file immediately, but if you want maximum impact, maximum evidence of their intent, I'd suggest giving them 2 to 3 weeks. Let them settle in. Let them make mistakes. Let them reveal their true character to the people around them. I nodded. I was already thinking about Julian's business, the consulting firm he'd been planning, the grand opening he'd started bragging about on social media. Mr. Brooks, I need you to draft the paperwork. A quiet title action that removes my mother's name from the deed entirely. An eviction notice for my brother. And everything we'll need if she contests it. He stood, gathered the documents carefully, and placed a hand on my shoulder. Your father would be proud. Sarah, he spent his whole life protecting this land for you. I'm going to help you reclaim it. After he left, I sat alone at the diner table and allowed myself one small, cold smile. They'd given me exactly what I needed. Now, I just had to wait for the right moment to use it. Days 1 through 7, I didn't go back to the house. Instead, I booked a corporate apartment for a month and pretended to fall apart. To the outside world, to my mother, who texted sporadically with veiled cruelty, to my brother, who didn't text at all. I was a broken woman, too shocked and traumatized to fight back. I sent my mother a text. I'm staying in a corporate apartment. I'm too tired to fight you. Just please don't ruin my furniture. Her response was a single heart emoji. It was the most insulting thing I'd ever seen. The next day, I hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb. I'd found him through a careful search of online reviews and references. He was meticulous, professional, and had zero sympathy for people who committed fraud. When I explained the situation to him, he nodded slowly. I can document everything, he said. Daily photos of the property, vehicles coming and going, activities visible from public areas. If your mother and brother are doing something illegal on that property, I'll catch it. Days 8 through 14. Marcus sent me photos every single day. They arrived in my email-marked case, Romano Property Day #. In day 3's photos, I saw the banner. It was enormous, draped across my front porch like a trophy. Alpha entrepreneur Julian Romano, consulting firm grand opening. The arrogance of it nearly took my breath away. In day 5's photos, I saw Silas. He was on my back deck, wearing my father's old bathrobe, the burgundy one with the brass buttons that Dad had left to me specifically, drinking what looked like wine from my mother's good stemware. My good stemware. The set I'd inherited from my grandmother. In day 9's photos, there were people everywhere. Caterers, decorators, a valet service being set up. Julian wasn't just throwing a party. He was throwing a production, a spectacle designed to announce to the entire neighborhood that he'd arrived, that he'd succeeded, that he deserved to be here. Every photo was a log on the fire of my rage. Day 15. Marcus called me with information that made my blood run cold. I was at a coffee shop this morning. He said, the one 3 blocks from your house. Your mother came in with a group of friends. I was positioned at the counter behind a newspaper. She didn't know I was there. And she's been telling everyone that you're emotionally unstable, that you've had a breakdown, that she had to take control of the property for your own good. She's been gaslighting the entire neighborhood about the situation. Did she mention the marriage? No. In fact, she introduced her new husband as a recent friend. When someone asked directly if they were married, she laughed and said, "That's not important right now. What's important is that Julian finally has the support he needs to become successful." I closed my eyes. The gaslighting was so thick, I could almost taste it. She was reframing me as the villain, the unstable daughter, the ungrateful child. She was building a narrative in which her theft became my mother's heroic intervention. She was counting on the neighborhood's sympathy. She didn't know that sympathy could evaporate in a single evening. Day 16. I received a recording attached to Marcus's email. Audio from the coffee shop. My mother's voice, light and laughing as she explained to her friends how she was finally giving Julian the head start he deserved, how her emotionally unstable daughter was incapable of managing property, how she'd had to take action. Then came the sentence that made me pause the recording and listen to it 3 times. I'm planning a grand opening for Friday night. Diane said, "We're inviting the whole neighborhood. It's going to be Julian's moment to shine. By the time Serafina realizes what's happened, it'll be too late for her to do anything about it." She was using my brother's event as cover, as a celebration of her victory. As it turned out, she was also handing me the exact stage I needed. Friday, March 29th, 7:47 p.m. The neighborhood was lined with cars, expensive cars, Tesla sedans and Range Rovers, and a Porsche 911 that someone had paid at least $100,000 for. My street, my quiet craftsman neighborhood, had been transformed into a parking lot for people who had no idea what was actually happening inside that red-doored house. My house. The exterior was lit up with professional spotlights, the kind that event planners use to make ordinary buildings look extraordinary. The sound of upbeat jazz drifted through the evening air, mixed with laughter and the clink of glasses. Caterers moved through the crowd with silver trays of appetizers. A valet station had been set up at the curb, complete with a small podium and attendants in matching uniforms. Julian was throwing a party, and he was making absolutely sure that everyone knew it. I pulled up to the curb in a plain black SUV, parking 2 houses down, out of direct sight. I sat there for a moment, watching the crowd, watching the light spill from my windows, watching my brother through the glass as he held court in my living room, telling a group of people about designing the interior myself. The lie tasted almost sweet when I heard it. At 7:52 p.m., Mr. Brooks pulled up behind me in his silver Lincoln. At 7:55 p.m., 2 county sheriffs arrived in an unmarked vehicle. At 7:58 p.m., the moving crew, 5 people in matching Navy uniforms, parked their truck at the curb. I stepped out of the SUV at exactly 8 p.m. I was wearing a charcoal suit that I'd bought specifically for this moment. My dark hair was pulled back in a tight knot. My makeup was perfect. Not too much, not too little, just enough to ensure that when I spoke, people would listen. My heels clicked against the pavement as I walked. A steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, like the pulse of justice moving forward. People began to notice. Heads turned. Conversations paused. I could see my mother through the frosted glass of my front door, standing near the entrance with a glass of champagne in her hand. She was wearing a new diamond necklace, another gift to herself from my savings account. If Marcus's photos were accurate, she was smiling her perfect smile, the one she'd perfected over 53 years of manipulation and self-deception. That smile was about to disappear. As I reached the walkway, Diane spotted me through the glass. I watched her face transform in real time, from relaxed pleasure to sudden alarm. She set down her champagne and hurried toward the door, her heels clicking in an arrhythmic counter-rhythm to mine. She reached the porch as I did, moving to block my path. "Sarah, what are you doing here? You're not invited. Leave now before you embarrass yourself." Her voice was low and venomous, designed so that only I could hear it. The smile had vanished, replaced by the true expression of someone who just realized their scheme was collapsing. I didn't stop walking. I stepped around her, not roughly but with a kind of immovable purpose, and reached the front porch. Behind me, Mr. Brooks followed, along with the 2 sheriffs. The moving crew remained at a respectful distance, waiting for the signal. The jazz music faltered and died as I turned to face the crowd of approximately 50 people. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, and my voice was steady, clearer, somehow, than my mother's. "I'm Serafina Marie Romano, the actual owner of this home. I'd like to thank you all for coming to what I believe was intended as a celebration. Unfortunately, the people hosting this event are trespassing." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Julian stepped forward, his face flushed with wine and anger. "Sarah, shut up. Mom is the owner. Get out of here." His voice cracked on the last word, the voice of someone whose entire world had suddenly become unstable. I looked at the lead sheriff. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped onto the porch and handed Julian a folder. "This is an immediate order of reversion," Mr. Brooks announced to the room, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent in courtrooms. "Diane Romano, your marriage to Silas Blackwell on March 14th of this year triggered a forfeiture clause in the Caleb Family Trust. You have violated the explicit conditions of your life estate, and you no longer have any legal right to this property. Silas Blackwell, as a non-heir party claiming residency through fraudulent means, you are being served with immediate removal notice. And Julian Romano, your tenancy was granted by someone with no authority to do so. You are being served with an immediate eviction order." Diane's knees buckled. She grabbed the porch railing, her knuckles white. "Marriage? I don't know what you're talking about," she shrieked, her voice climbing higher with each word. I pulled out a laminated copy of her Nevada marriage certificate and held it up for the neighbors to see. The certificate had been photographed to show all the relevant details: the filing date of March 14th, the signatures of both Diane and Silas, the embossed seal of Clark County Court. The whispering was like a wave crashing against the house. I could see it happening in real time. The moment when her church friends began to understand that they'd been lied to, that the narrative Diane had built around unstable Serafina was a fabrication designed to cover her own theft. One of the neighbors, a woman I recognized as someone who attended Diane's book club, leaned over to her companion and said quietly, "She told us Serafina was the one with the problem. She's a liar." Diane's face went from white to red to a kind of mottled purple that suggested her blood pressure was approaching dangerous levels. "The movers are here," I said calmly, my eyes never leaving my mother's. "They will be collecting anything that belongs to me and placing the rest on the curb. You have 30 minutes to gather your personal clothing and belongings. After that, the locks are being changed. You will not have access to this property ever again." Julian tried to lunge at me, but the sheriff caught his arm and pinned it behind his back with practiced efficiency. "Don't make this a criminal matter, kid," the officer warned. "You're already on thin ice." Julian was sobbing now, not dignified tears, but the blubbering, gasping sounds of someone whose entire fantasy had collapsed. "But my business, my equipment, everything I just invested in." I turned to him, and my voice was cold and clear. "That equipment was purchased with stolen funds from my accounts. Julian, thousands of dollars that you and Mother took without permission. Mr. Brooks has documented every transaction. That equipment stays here as partial compensation for the damages you've done to my home and my property." The moving crew began their work. They moved efficiently, carrying out my mother's exercise bike, her personal boxes, her furniture. They moved with the precision of people who understood that they were instruments of justice, not just labor. The grand opening, lights flickered and died. The neighbors didn't just leave. They fled. It was like watching a dam break. People moved toward their cars in small groups, some casting pitying glances backward, most simply eager to escape the spectacle of a woman's carefully constructed lies being dismantled in public. Silas was the first to leave, sprinting to his car, without even looking back at his new wife. The woman who'd lied to her friends who'd stolen from her daughter, who'd raised a son incapable of earning anything on his own. Diane stood on my lawn, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing the sum total of her life, as the evening light faded to darkness. She looked at me, and her eyes were full of a desperate, narcissistic rage, the rage of someone who'd never been held accountable and couldn't understand how it was happening now. "You've destroyed the family, Serafina," she screamed. "You're a monster. How could you do this to your brother?" I leaned over the porch railing and looked down at the woman who'd given me life and then tried to steal my future. "The family died the moment you left me in the rain, Mom," I said quietly. "I'm just the one who's cleaning up the mess." I turned and walked back into my house. The red door closed behind me with a soft but decisive click. I didn't look back. The next morning, I stood in my living room, my actual living room, with my furniture, my books, my velvet chair, and called the locksmith. "I want a biometric system," I said, "the most advanced one on the market. I want my thumbprint to be the only thing that can open the doors to this house." By noon, it was installed. I spent the next 3 days cleaning, scrubbing, washing away the smell of Julian's cheap cologne and my mother's cigarette smoke and years of lies that seemed to have seeped into the walls like poison. I found my father's jewelry in Diane's old bedroom, pieces he'd left to me that she'd been planning to sell. I took them back and placed them in my safe. I found photographs of me that had been moved to the back of closets, replaced by pictures of Julian. I rehung them. I found evidence of the fraud in my mother's desk, receipts for the credit card charges, bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, documentation of her attempts to hide assets. I gave all of it to Mr. Brooks. By the end of the week, the legal machinery was in motion. The quiet title action was filed. The eviction was formal. The fraud charges were documented and ready to be presented to the authorities if needed. On a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the grand opening, I received a frantic call from Silas. "Sarah, your mother is telling everyone I stole the money for the marriage license," he shouted, panic evident in every syllable. "She's trying to sue me for emotional distress and abandonment. She says I took her money and disappeared. This is insane." I laughed. "A cold, bright sound like ice breaking. That sounds like a Diane problem. Silas, I'd suggest getting a good lawyer. Good luck with the life coaching." I hung up. I realized then that my mother would always find someone else to blame. She would spend the rest of her life in a tiny apartment telling anyone who would listen that her evil daughter had stolen her dream, ruined her golden years, destroyed her family. The neighbors would nod politely and change the subject. The courthouse records would be public. The truth would be available to anyone with the intelligence to look for it. Julian didn't fare much better. Without my house to act as a backdrop for his consulting firm, the whole enterprise collapsed. He tried to call me a dozen times, his voicemails growing increasingly desperate as the days went on. "Come on, Sarah, we're family," he begged in one that I listened to only once. I made a mistake. I was influenced by Mom. I didn't know what I was doing. I blocked his number without responding. Being family was a privilege he'd forfeited the moment he mouthed, "Go away," through my own front door. I decided to do one final thing to honor my father. Using a portion of the money I recovered from the fraud, money that my mother was ordered to pay back through wage garnishment, money that would arrive in my account each month like a penance she could never fully complete, I established a scholarship fund. The Thomas Augustine Romano Memorial Scholarship would provide financial support to young people pursuing careers in land surveying and law. In particular, it would prioritize students from single-parent households, students who'd experienced financial hardship, students who understood that knowledge and persistence could be more powerful than any inheritance. The scholarship was established with $50,000. My father's name would be associated with justice, not betrayal, with education, not cruelty, with the kind of legacy that survives and grows, rather than one that withers in the face of truth. I placed a photograph of him on my living room mantel, the one taken on his 50th birthday, where he was smiling his quiet, knowing smile, the smile of a man who understood exactly who his wife was and exactly how to protect his daughter from her own naivety. I felt like he was finally at rest in his own house. 3 months later, I received the formal court order. The judge had signed the order of quiet title. My mother's name was officially scrubbed from the deed, erased from the legal history of my home as if she'd never been there at all. The house now belonged to me in perpetuity, with no claims, no contingencies, no conditions that anyone could use against me. She was ordered to pay back $40,000 in unauthorized credit card charges and $15,000 in fraudulent utility billing done under my name. She didn't have the money, of course. Her wages were garnished every 2 weeks when her part-time job at a craft store, the only employment she could find, deposited a modest paycheck into her bank account. A portion was automatically transferred to me. Some months it was $200. Some months it was $3. I didn't need the money, but I kept it. I watched the transfers appear in my bank account like clockwork, like a monthly reminder that actions have consequences, that the world doesn't owe anyone a free pass just because they gave birth to you. The neighborhood's gossip mill had done its work. By spring, everyone knew what had really happened. They'd seen the documents. They'd heard the story from multiple angles. Diane had lost her social circle. The women who'd once called themselves her friends began to distance themselves. They had a name for women who lied to cover their theft, and it wasn't concerned mother. Julian attempted to salvage his consulting business from a studio apartment in a worse neighborhood. It didn't work. He needed my house. He needed the prestige. He needed the foundation that I'd built. Without it, his entire fantasy crumbled. I received a second voicemail from him 6 months after the eviction. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was different this time. Quieter, smaller, genuinely broken. "I was an idiot. I let Mom convince me that I deserved something I didn't earn. I'm sorry for locking you out. I'm sorry for treating your house like it was mine. You were right to do what you did. I deserved it." I didn't call him back. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about absolving someone of their guilt. Sometimes it's simply about deciding that they're no longer worth your energy. It was a warm Tuesday evening in late May when I sat on my front porch with a cup of tea and allowed myself to really look at my home. The rain from that cold March evening was a distant memory now. The garden I'd replanted was starting to bloom. Peonies and lavender, the flowers my father had loved, the ones my mother had ripped out to make room for her exercise equipment. I took a sip of the tea, a blend imported from a small shop in the city, something I'd bought as a small celebration of reclamation, and looked at my red door. I wasn't the girl who'd been locked out anymore. I wasn't the woman who'd believed her family loved her more than they loved money. I was the woman who'd taken back her life with nothing but documents, evidence, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing that time is always on the side of the truth. I was the woman who'd walked into her own grand opening and taken everything away. I was the woman with the only key that mattered. The biometric lock on my red door would open for no one but me. My thumbprint, my house, my justice. I'd spent 5 years building this home with my own 2 hands and my own ruthless discipline. My mother had tried to take it in a single afternoon. I'd taken it back in a single evening, not through violence or cruelty, but through the most powerful force available to anyone willing to be patient. The truth. The peonies swayed in the evening breeze. The lavender released its fragrance into the cooling air. And somewhere in the city, in a small apartment that was the best she could afford on her garnished wages, my mother was learning what it meant to face consequences. She was learning what I'd known since March, that you can't steal from people who are paying attention. I finished my tea and stood, looking at the house one more time before I went inside. It was mine. It had always been mine. And now, finally, everyone knew it. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by a locked door or a mother's betrayal. My journey proves that silence is a weapon and strategic patience is power when you're reclaiming a life that others tried to steal. If you've been gaslit into invisibility, share this. Tell them, your silence isn't weakness. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary, especially when the people meant to love you try to leave you out in the rain. The revolution happens when you write your own ending. Have you ever had to reclaim your dignity from a family that underestimated you? Share your story in the comments below. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories about turning humiliation into triumph.